especially his brother, Robert Zimmerman, who joins us now. We know it's been an incredibly long evening for your family. Last thing you wanted to do was leave them, but I know that getting out and getting the message from the family out is also important. So let's start with the obvious. When's the last time you had a chance to speak with your brother and get a sense of where his head is now?
We heard from George last night. He is adjusting. That's really the best way I can put it. I think he's been kind of caged in. He's had these constraints with GPS and having to show up to court every day and having this weighing on him. Freedom is kind of a new concept to him all over again. As bizarre as it sounds, he really is free to move about this country and do whatever he pleases for the first time in a long time.
Any idea of plan for him now?
No. I, as his brother, would like to see him heal, recenter himself, take some time to rest, to relax. The stress has been incredible on him, on our family. I think it's important that he takes some time for himself. He's been through a lot. I can't foresee any plans or any meaningful engagement that he'd have with society for a while because of the threats that are still going around and continue to.
I want to ask you about that because you have mentioned previous concern for your brother's safety and your family's safety, and that continues as well. I mean, Mark O'Mara had even told CNN that George doesn't go out without either wearing a disguise or some body armor, something under his clothing. What are the threats that your family has been receiving?
You know, people take to social media, and I know it's just someone behind a computer screen, and that might embolden them, but the threats are vile, they're vicious, they're disgusting, and they are sometimes in person, like people wearing shirts with my brother's face on it in crosshairs or encouraging others to act out violently against him. I know that you can't take every one of those seriously, but you can't afford to be wrong about a threat either, because you could be dead wrong if somebody really were intent on harming you. So
what kind of steps are you taking as a family for yourself as well for George going forward? Because he can't stay in his home all the time. I mean,
right.
he is re-entering society.
Right, sure. And that is actually something that's kind of new to him. You know, if going out in armor and disguises, but having a curfew and only doing it in one county kind of limits you. So now as he engages the world, as anyone in his situation would, without those restrictions, he's going to have to learn to move about in a very low-profile way and keep to himself. I came out to New York preemptively expecting a not guilty verdict. I guess it's just a sign of how much we trust his attorneys, the representation he had, and how much we trust the system. And that was, you know, another step that we had to take. I don't foresee being able to leave Florida after a verdict like that with my last name.
I mean, you've had threats against the family, but now there are threats of new charges, possibly. We have the president of the NAACP was just on with our colleague Candy Crowley talking about how civil rights leaders like himself, Ben Jealous, and others, they are pushing for the Justice Department to bring federal civil rights charges against your brother. And even the Florida State's attorney had kind of talked about that last night after the verdict. Let's listen to a little bit of what Angela Corey said.
This case has never been about race, nor has it ever been about the right to bear arms, not in the sense of proving this as a criminal case. But Trayvon Martin was profiled. There is no doubt that he was profiled to be a criminal. And if race was one of the aspects in George Zimmerman's mind, then we believe that we put out the proof necessary to show that Zimmerman did profile Trayvon Martin.
What Angela Corey says right there is something that in the aftermath of the verdict, we're hearing a lot. There is a very big push now for bringing civil rights charges against your brother. What do you say to them?
It sounds to me like what she's saying is that race was never a factor. I think that's the first thing she said. And she believes or alleges, which has been disproven in a court of law, that George somehow criminally profiled Trayvon Martin. I think that I would encourage Mr. Jealous, who I describe as a self-professed civil rights leader. I don't think he does anything for civil rights by perpetuating a narrative that has now been proven false and calling for an arrest and then a conviction, and it didn't happen. So now there's more agitation by the same players that were insisting that George was a murderer and a racist to begin with.
But the Justice Department is gathering information. I mean, the Justice Department is not directly responding to the NAACP's request, but it is gathering information, and there is an investigation going on.
Right, and we welcomed actually that investigation through the FBI when they originally started investigating George. They've investigated, I think, about 36 of his closest friends and acquaintances, and there is not any inkling of racism. In fact, there's evidence to show the opposite. So I would encourage them to cool their jets, give everyone some time to kind of process what's going on. Agitation doesn't help us. It doesn't do anybody any good right now.
Let's get to the specifics of the night. Not to retry the case, but to understand the perspective that you're coming from versus all the people who believe this verdict is very wrong, and that even though it wasn't shown in court doesn't mean it didn't happen. Does your brother find himself responsible for anything that night?
Yeah, I think I disagree. What court is supposed to precisely show or prove that something happened, and not having that proven proves, in fact, that it does not happen, or it at least cannot be proven that it took place that way.
To the level of the standard required in court.
Right, but you have to remember that part of the evidence are George's statements that, police found to be consistent, or any inconsistencies are, attributed to just simply repeating something as a human being would. We're not typewriters. It was nothing concerning. So those statements...
To the prosecution it was, though, right? I mean, they called him a liar. It was the basis of their case.
Right, that was the basis of their case. It's a weak premise for a prosecutor to go about trying to prove a case just by name-calling somebody. But, we have a verdict. I think we should really take a step back, respect that verdict, respect those 6 women, an all-women jury, who had to make a really tough call and had to look at this outside of all of the emotions that were stirred up and all of the racial innuendo that was stirred up, and just kind of look at the facts, and the facts spoke for themselves.
From your brother's perspective, you know where his head is on these things. Do you believe that he looks at things he did that night and says, I wish I hadn't? I regret having a round in the chamber, or following him when I was told it wasn't necessary, or starting something or continuing something. What does he regret?
I'll tell you what. I'll tell you that when this happened, George wasn't the same. He was profoundly saddened. He was completely a somber person that was just not himself. Regret is a very strong word. Regret implies that your actions, you have culpability in what you did for what happened. And I think that's what you're asking is, does he share or accept the blame? I think that George, outside of the word blame, feels and has felt, and I've expressed this before, very bad. He even told the police officer, Doris Singleton, he asked her, are you Catholic? That came out in court, because in my religion, death, by any standard, is a tragedy, whether it's abortion or self-defense or what have you. So he does have emotion about the fact that he had to take a life in self-defense, but that is incompatible with finding culpability in what he did.
Have you ever heard him say, I wish I didn't do it that night?
No, in fact, I've heard him say the opposite.
What do you mean?
Well, he had that interview with Sean Hannity, and that was, presented in court as well. And I don't think that people who are forthcoming and forthright with what they do and believe they're doing the right thing should then go back. That's the way we were taught always as children. If you do the right thing all the time, or what you believe to be right, you don't have to go back and make amends for that and say, it should have been this way. If it should have been that way now, and you can think of that in hindsight, then it should have been that way then.
All right.
We're going to take a quick break here and come back with Robert Zimmerman. A lot to talk about his brother's feelings about that night and the reaction to the verdict. Stay with us.
Be right back.
Welcome back to this special edition of Newsroom. We're here with Robert Zimmerman. Let's continue our conversation where we left it off. This is a big point. You're saying what he did was right that night, it's right today. I'm asking something a little different. Taking someone's life is the last thing you should ever want to do.
Right.
Does your brother feel that way, that he wishes he hadn't taken this 17-year-old's life?
Well, that's two different questions, really. Taking someone's life is the last thing you should ever want to do. I would agree that that's what came out in court. That's exactly how he felt. He didn't find out until he was at the police station that he had, in fact, taken someone's life, and he was distraught by that thought.
He really didn't know?
No, he really didn't know. He asked Officer Doris Singleton, and she revealed to him in an interview, in his first interview with police, that Trayvon Martin had expired, that he had died, and he was dismayed by that. But when you're saying, is that what I should or shouldn't do, or, self-defense is self-defense, and people who carry guns, who discharge them, are trained and taught that there's only one reason or one legal way that you should discharge a weapon. You don't discharge them to wound people, or you don't discharge them, you don't brandish them, or you don't, shoot up in the air to control a crazy party. That's what happened. He was an armed person who Mr. Martin, unfortunately, isn't here to express any regrets he might have today. But Mr. Martin had plans for George that night, and unfortunately his plans and his encounter with George began with breaking his nose. I wish it weren't that way, but it is.
Will George carry a gun now?
I don't know. I heard from Pierce Morgan actually last night that his gun was returned to him, or that at least he's eligible to have it returned to him. I don't know that he'll carry a gun. I would think that he has more reason to now than before, because there are so many more people who want him dead and that know that he's free, but at the same time he can move about a little bit more than he did before.
Now, I want to ask you about one of the biggest questions that kind of hung over this trial, this 3 weeks as we watched it. Will George Zimmerman take the stand? Mark O'Mara had said that George wanted to take the stand,
right,
but under the advice of counsel, he did not take the stand in the end. What did George want to say?
The truth. The same truth that he told the police from the beginning, the same truth that he told Sean Hannity, the same truth that he told his family. When this first happened, George reached out to each family member individually to tell them what had happened. It was important to him that the truth came from him to his brother, his mother, his father, his sister, or whomever, that it didn't come from some other source.
If he didn't think that was being represented, or he thinks that he really wanted to have his say in court, why didn't he? The Judge Deborah Nelson made it very clear that she wanted it to be his decision and no one else's.
Right, which is what the law, suggests, that is our right as defendants. I think I would be kind of the same way as George. I think that when you don't have anything to hide, you talk, and I think it says a lot about him that night. This wasn't a whodunit. He didn't run away.
But he didn't end up taking the stand.
He didn't take the stand in his defense in that proceeding, in that trial, but he did take the stand in a sense because he had so many other statements that he made to police, to Sean Hannity, interviews that he did with cops.
And you know that a big concern, Robert, was that he'd get caught in inconsistencies. And while you said earlier, well, they were nothing that really mattered, obviously, to the jury, that may or may not be true, because one thing in particular, do you know what stand your ground is? No. And then you have the professor come on and says he got an A in the class that was largely about stand your ground. That speaks to a desire to conceal knowledge of what mattered most. It speaks to maybe your brother thinking, this can go my way.
Yeah, I think that what I actually said was that the police who were investigating it didn't find any kind of these tiny little minor, was it the bushes or was it the darkness or was it the bushes in the dark? Who knows? They did not find anything like that.
But you get my question. Why say you don't know what stand your ground is?
I think stand your ground. I'm sure if the professor, Captain, said that he taught that in that class, he taught many things in that class. My brother got an A because he paid attention to that class. But I don't know that term stand your ground is kind of like a catchphrase for that one part of the self-defense statute. So I think the media started using that term. Because of Florida's stand your ground law, George Zimmerman will not be arrested, or the police are, saying...
You either know what it is or you don't. Stand your ground is what we all know it to be, especially your brother. And he said he didn't know about it.
Right.
I'm only harping on it because it goes to something that's central to what your brother did that night when he killed Trayvon Martin, and he pleaded ignorance of it with Sean Hannity. And it was a lie.
No, it wasn't a lie.
How not?
I take exception to that. You don't know that George knows what he was taught in class as the stand your ground law. You just called my brother a liar without actually having asked him, do you know that 786.012 is called this by the media or by, whatever catchphrase you want to call it, or 786.031 is called that. Stand your ground is just the popular term for that part of the statute. But what the statute is actually named is justifiable use of force. What that part of the statute is actually named, that paragraph.
So you're saying your brother didn't know it by its most commonly referred to name? That's what you're saying?
I think you'd have to ask him. I think the way I know it and I understand it is if someone tries to kill you or you perceive that you could be killed or another, you have the right to defend yourself up to and including with a firearm.
You get why it made people curious, though, right?
Of course I do, yeah.
One of the other most poignant moments in the trial that, if you watched any of our coverage, you would also point out is when two mothers testified. You have Trayvon Martin's mother, and you have your mother testifying. Clearly emotional and clearly impacted. Of course, it impacted everyone, and I'm sure it impacted the jury as well. What has it been like for your mother to take the stand, and what was it like watching Trayvon Martin's mother take the stand?
I didn't watch Trayvon Martin's mother or my mother when they were on the stand, but I've seen it since then, and I didn't because of what's known as the rule of sequestration. We were witnesses, and we could have been called in court.
Have you spoken to your mother? What was that day like?
Of course, I've spoken to my mother. Yeah,
Right.
I mean, I spoke to her before. She was very nervous. I spoke to her after she came home and kind of broke down and sighed a sigh of relief that part of her involvement in the trial was over, foreseeably, unless she was recalled. It was difficult. I mean, she knows that that's her son's voice. We've all known that that was George's voice. And kind of like on a side note, we were actually kind of strangely encouraged when we learned that these tapes were going to come out and everyone would hear George's voice and this matter would be put to rest. Instead, the opposite happened. There was kind of like a window of calm where, people were saying, oh, good, here we hear the person who is being attacked screaming. The police have said all of his statements are consistent with evidence. He said to the police, I screamed for help and nobody came. But then it got spun again by Mr. Crump and Miss Natalie Jackson into 2 shots fired, a boy pleading for his life, and here's another shot, the kill shot, and people, the media, were very complicit with promoting their narrative.
They had witnesses of their own saying that whose
No,
voice
they
that
went
was.
out and said that they heard 2 shots fired. They did that before we got into a trial. They went out and said, Mr. Crump and Miss Jackson both, that you hear a clear shot, that you hear a boy pleading for his life, and then you hear George execute him, or something to that effect.
But that did not make it into the courtroom. That was not presented to the jury.
Right. What you're saying is that is not in fact truth, and courtrooms have a way of filtering what's actually true. So what they did was they took a false narrative, a narrative based on untruths, and the media ran with it. And the media puts them on television and doesn't rebut any of their assertions, even when they're caught in their fabrications.
So are you and your family? I mean, I sense that you're angry at the media.
I'm not angry at the media. I think the media has to do a better job when you have people injecting race into things. A red flag has to go up right away, especially after a case like this, where 2 very crafty attorneys got away with fabricating a completely scripted narrative and selling it to the American people through the media, through CNN, through ABC, through NBC. They did it themselves. To borrow a line from the movie Argo, if you want to sell a lie, have the media sell it for you. And I guess there's no better example of that than Mr. Crump and Miss Jackson.
You think it's that far-fetched that on a night where an unarmed 17-year-old winds up getting shot and killed, you only have the one main witness who is the killer, and they have injuries that are somewhat obvious but not necessarily consistent with having someone try to kill you, that's something that might be investigated, charged, and tried?
Well, they didn't have those answers at the time. What they had were questions, and I don't begrudge parents for having questions about how their son ended up dead. What I take issue with is with attorneys coming in, dropping the race card on the table because they don't have the answers that they want when they want them, and they're not the answers that they wanted. So everyone is a racist. George Zimmerman is a racist. The Sanford Police Department are racist. The State Attorney's Office are racist. The Florida Department of Law Enforcement are racist. And in fact, when he reached out, according to him, to this witness that he interviewed on the phone, he didn't want to involve the police because he had lost all faith in the police. So I do take issue with the media when people are using race to perpetuate falsehoods, simply just running with their story.
Look, we appreciate you being here to give your side of the story. We look forward to see what you or your brother or your family does next in terms of helping people come together after this. It's going to be the most important part.
Thank you,
It's the
Chris.
beginning of a long journey for you and your family.
Thank you, Kate.
Robert. Thanks so much for coming in. We really appreciate it.